This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts
is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
What is sex-positive black sexuality? What impact has black respectability had on black people's concerns about their own bodies and their own relationship to sex? These and many other questions will be answered by today's guests, Professor Shayne Lee of Tulane University and Professor Treva Lindsey of the University of Missouri at Columbia. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black. Hi, this is Mark Anthony Neal, and you are here watching Left of Black. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Shayne Lee, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at Tulane University in New Orleans. Professor Lee is the author of 3 books, including Holy Mavericks, Evangelical Innovators, and the Spiritual Marketplace, and his brand new book, Erotic Revolutionaries, Black Women, Sexuality, and Popular Culture. How are you doing today, Shayne?
I'm doing great. Great to be here.
It's great to have you here in the Big Easy, and of course, you know, because you're here from the Big Easy, how is life in New Orleans these days? You know, it's been 5 years, and you know, Tulane is a centerpiece, at least, of the intellectual culture in the city. You know, how are things 5 years later?
I think it depends on where you're situated, because for those of us with resources and good jobs, things are going great. But I think for a lot of people who didn't react well to the crisis and didn't have the resources to undergird them, they're still struggling to make it. So I guess it's New Orleans is New Orleans, because it was going on like that before Katrina, but now I think Katrina even exasperated that even more. Some people can't even come back yet.
Yeah. And yet you still managed to be there and to do the work. Tell us about this new book. You know, what is an erotic revolutionary?
It's a woman in pop culture who exhibits a strong sense of proactive sexuality in various ways to challenge the politics of respectability, whether it's exhibiting sexual agency or exhibiting sexual autonomy, just the idea of, or new sexual scripts. I use script as a metaphor to suggest ways of seeing the world that challenge the traditional assumptions that usually deal with gendered double standards that, in particular, that black women have to live up to certain middle class standards in order not to be typecast and hypersexualized. And so an erotic revolutionary goes and says, let's not become prudes. Let's see the ways in which we can enjoy the same erotic space that men enjoy without being called sluts.
Let's talk about this for a second, this concept of black respectability. You know, at least in intellectual circles, it's become a very popular term. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, in fact, writes a whole book around this idea of black respectability. What exactly is black respectability?
I think Lisa Thompson does a great job in her book, Beyond the Black Lady.
Yes, that's my old girl, El Boogie.
Yeah, I love using that book for my class now. I love the book. I think she really explains the idea of the black middle class woman and the responsibility to uphold a certain standard or sets of standards that deconstruct the hypersexualization of black women in the media by racist institutions, people, the historic misportrayal of black women is sort of the backdrop behind this idea of the black lady as almost like the Victorian era, a woman who has dignity, respect, who is sexually chaste, who conducts her business in a certain way. And especially in the South, as Lisa Thompson mentions, this idea of the black woman, the lady, has a certain degree of respectability she must maintain. Whereas black middle class men are allowed way more space, erotic space, sensual space, sexual space to identify themselves. The black lady is, she has a cramped space, and she must always have a dignified sort of portrayal. And I think that.
Go ahead.
I think that could be I think that can be good when you think of the historical oppression that
Right.
Black women
Right.
have faced and how they've been misrepresented and hypersexualized. But I think the extreme version is what happens when Black women don't have safe spaces to be erotic, when they're called sluts for doing the same thing men do all the time.
And you mentioned, this idea of thinking about popular culture as really a subversive site, right? I mean, there's specific kind of political realities around Black respectability, whether that we're talking the late 19th and early 20th century, or even today. But popular culture becomes this interesting space, where women can exhibit women performers, right? And women who consume Black popular culture can really exhibit some sort of sexual agency. In your opening chapter, I mean, you look at the examples of three very different types of performers. Janet Jackson, you look at Beyonce, and of course Jill Scott. Talk a little bit about what was significant about these three performers within this context of doing this kind of subversive sexuality in their performances.
What surprised me was the unity that I saw, because Beyonce represents sort of Generation Y, a whole different set of people. And Janet Jackson, she was a huge influence on a lot of my Gen X peers in helping women to kind of embody more empowering sexual scripts. And Jill Scott is often typecast as this enlightened soul sister who's just highly conscious.
Right, Philly thick, as I like to refer to her.
As I refer to, borrowing from you. Exactly, and I think what's missing is all three women represent new spaces to express the Black body as an erotic body, as one that longs after men, that longs after an erotic interplay. Their songs have various ranges of sort of spaces. Sometimes they play the victim, the woman who's been sexualized. Sometimes they play the victor, the sexual conqueror. And so they have a broad constellation of different types that they portray in their songs. And I think that gives Black women sort of these spaces to pretend and to think and to transcend maybe some of the more confined spaces that they've had. So I think all three of them show an incredible range of experiences that the Black female sexual body sort of encounters in her everyday existence, especially the idea of this empowered sort of this force of sexuality that Audre Lorde alludes to. And I think they kind of make it safe to long after sensual interactions.
There's an aspect of our culture, broadly American culture, that systematically denies women the ability to express sex as something that's pleasurable. We attach all kinds of motivations on what women do sexually, right? They're gold diggers, they're after money, after power, prestige, job positions. Very rarely do we ever just say that women enjoy sex. And of course, that's even much more of a critical issue within Black communities because of the kind of pathology that's always been historically associated with Black sexuality. Do you find that that's something that, for everyday Black folks, I mean, you're the sociologist, that there still is this reticence to embrace the full power of sexuality, in the context of everyday Black lives?
Oh, yes. And I think that reticence comes from the pragmatic reality that once they express themselves that way, there might be a consequence. There might be this blithe branding of them as a slut, this careless, swift sort of punishment for expressing themselves as sexual beings. So I think I heard Trisha Rose mention this in a documentary on Black women and sexuality, that many women are nervous. Even the ones who want to kind of engage in more erotic spaces, they know that there's a brand waiting for them. And I think that's why we feminists and we scholars, we have to do the intellectual work to challenge this. And I think Black feminist thought has done a great job of challenging the hypersexualization of Black women and the misportrayal, but I don't think it's done an adequate job of fighting for Black female sexual agency.
One of the subjects that you talk about, Serena Williams and the power chicks. And it's a very interesting discussion because, while, let me give you a story. I'm sitting up in the barbershop 2 or 3 years ago. A wide range of folks in the barbershop, college professors like myself, working class guys, young cats, and there's a copy of King magazine in the barbershop. It happens to be the King magazine with the Serena Williams spread. And we all kind of literally like pass the magazine around and have this kind of moment, damn, right? and so we understand how her body traffics in black male sexual desire. By the same token, you have a gaze that's upon her in terms of mainstream tennis and white commentators that can very easily see how sexuality plays in the career and popularity of someone like Anna Kournikova, but don't quite understand how someone like Serena Williams traffics the same way. So it's this interesting kind of fine line between objectifying Serena Williams because of what she represents in terms of black male sexual desire, but at the same time, a larger culture that even rejects the possibility that she would even be seen that way.
Interesting. And I think when she wore that black cat suit, that began to kind of change. I think even popular culture and the broad public began to see her as a sexual subject more than before. Not, you're totally right, not like Maria Sharapova or Anna Kournikova,
right,
but an increasing space for a black female athlete.
Right.
Serena, Layla Ali, and I
Lisa
think,
Leslie, right?
Definitely.
Cheryl Swoops.
Oh yeah. And I think what these athletes you're mentioning represent that black scholars I think have overlooked is a new day in which the black female body in athletic form can be both the sexual object and the sexual subject. Yeah. Whereas before, the trite kind of way of seeing the black female body is, okay, that's hypersexualized, don't show your flesh, that's bad, be a lady, the politics of respectability. Serena represents a woman who designs her own outfits, who chooses how she wants to portray her body, who's proud of her curves.
Right, incredible agency, right.
Yes,
right.
Incredible agency, and she kind of shows younger women how to be strong and sexy. And so Serena's brand is both the competent athlete. She's not reduced to a sex symbol.
Right.
She's treated as an
she actually wins matches as opposed to Kournikova. Right.
That's a great point. And I think her and Maria Sharapova, that's why I spent time in that chapter talking about when they had that match in 2007, because I think they both represent a time when we can celebrate the erotic energy their presence generates, at the same time celebrate their high levels of skill, determination, and their mental toughness. And so we're at a point in women's sports where we have the power chick, this sex symbol, who I feel is a better sex symbol than the Hollywood starlet who's emaciated and body doesn't look effectual, doesn't look powerful.
Size 3.5, yeah. Right.
The female athlete, Serena's body looks strong. She has to eat a lot of protein to maintain that kind of muscle, and she has to take care of her body. And so I think she represents a new day in which we can valorize sexiness in a way that's the individual's the sexual subject. She's in control of much of her image. She controls what she wears, how she wears it, and she's proud of her body. And she's such a competent, she's the best.
Right. Right.
So I think
her game.
She shows it's possible to see a female body as both competent and respected, and yet fantasize as an erotic sort of subject.
This is Mark Anthony Neal. You're watching Left to Black. Our guest this afternoon is Professor Shayne Lee of Tulane University. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit, Shayne. One of your later chapters really discusses and takes on sex in the black church. Black respectability, issues of repression, even in the context, and suppression in the black church. And of course, you've been very visible in the last couple of weeks in response to the Bishop Eddie Long case down in Atlanta, New Birth Missionary Baptist Church. How much of the controversy that's played out around this particular case, and in some ways, it's just the most visible case, right? The obviously myriad examples of this that take place that aren't going to be covered every day on CNN. How much of this kind of situation, whether we're talking about same-sex desire or heterosexual desire has to do with the profound ways that Black communities simply have not wrapped their heads around sexuality and sex. And the church has kind of been used as this space that ultimately cools everything out by denying us access to our bodies.
Oh, I mean, I couldn't say it better than that. That's so true. I think that's a salient factor. And I think it goes back to the Apostle Paul. The ways in which Black churches, a higher percentage of them are theologically conservative, so they take the New Testament literally. Paul has a lot to say about the body, the flesh, as he says it, the carnal nature, and he puts this flesh against the spirit. Walk in the spirit so you will not fulfill the lusts of the flesh.
Yeah.
For the flesh lusts against the spirit and the spirit against the flesh. So he presents this war, and you'll hear that kind of preaching in a lot of Black churches. Instead of a more sophisticated conversation about sexuality, you just hear,
right.
Don't go in the flesh.
Don't do it. Right. Don't do it. It's evil. Right.
And it creates this dirty kind of image of sex. And so when you have these scandals, because human beings, James Baldwin showed us in many of his novels what happens when you have these suppressed erotic urges. They come out in other ways. And when they do come out in the form of spiritual leadership, a lot of times we're surprised and shocked.
Yeah.
And it becomes a huge deal.
I remember 16, 17, 18 years ago when the LA riots occurred. Those LA riots became a litmus test for Black intellectuals. In some ways, the Eddie Long case is going to be this contemporary litmus case. Everyone's going to be asked, what's your opinion about this? When all is said and done, what is your gut reaction to what is happening at New Birth, or even more importantly, what kind of ramifications do you think this case will have going forward?
Yeah, I'll preface my response with the fact I'm catching some criticism from a lot of my colleagues who feel that the main issue isn't sexuality, it's abuse of power.
Right.
And I understand that criticism, but for me, just as a sociologist and looking at the ramifications of what's happening with one of the most powerful preachers in the country, to me, the big issue is sexuality. Knowing that the Black church has this view of homosexuality as something just depraved,
ungodly, right?
Yeah, totally ungodly, and
Right.
to the point where it's beyond fornication and other things. It's like it's an abomination.
Right.
And seeing, I would say, he got to, if this was the NBA, the top 5 players, we're talking preachers, top 5 preacher, you got to put Eddie Long just as far as his popularity, his range of influence, the size of his church. He's a major baller in the church, and to see him I think he's about to crumble. I think his spiritual empire is about to crumble over this issue of same-sex eroticism. So for me, that's the big story. I hear about pastors abusing their power all the time, and it's unfortunate, but it happens a lot. But here we have a situation where a very powerful preacher preached one thing and secretly might have done other things.
Right.
And it's come to light, and it's going to be hard for him to create a narrative that makes him look good and saves his ministry out of this. And I think there are other preachers like Long who are in the evangelical Black church context who sneak off and do their thing. And I know of cases just from interviews. I know I've been hearing about Eddie Long for like 5 years.
Right,
I mean,
right. Lot of chatter.
And so I think there's some other preachers who are nervous. I think that this might embolden some other members who were victimized or who just participated in sort of relationships. So I think this could be tremendous and good. The way you said as a litmus test, I like the way you put that for the LA riots. I think it's the same thing. We scholars then have to kind of analyze what's the next step.
Right.
How can we push this into a greater discourse about sexuality?
Right.
How can we create a new hermeneutic that replaces the trite evangelical approach to Paul? Maybe we can come up with a more creative way of seeing the biblical injunctions against homosexuality, a more inclusive way that convinces Christians that still upholds the authority of the Bible, yet it just is a better way of resolving them. So I think we have instead of just saying the church needs to become more liberal, we have the intellectual responsibility to offer persuasive, cogent hermeneutics
Right.
to convince them to accept it.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Shayne Lee of Tulane University, the author of the brand new book, Erotic Revolutionaries, Black Women, Sexuality, and Popular Culture. Thanks for joining us, Shayne.
Oh, it's my pleasure, totally.
Talk to you soon.
Take care, Mark.
Peace.
I'ma pitch it down the middle, baby. Hit it. I do it too right. It's good. Handle my business like a big girl should. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. Baby, give me more. Pick me up. You are my Ducati, all up on your frame. Baby, say my name. Show you how to get 'em. Show you how to do it. Left hip, right hip. Put your back into it.
Every weekend I see Dominicans in the chair. She could bring out the features in my hair. Add a couple of tracks for flair. My sponsor, he go and bye. He must be a rapper, baller, doctor, dentist, corner boy, cook, chef, chemist. Yeah, I don't even care. Just as long as he don't say bye. He ain't no square, he just like to share. In love with a tipper, throwing hundreds in the air. Throw some over here. And Louis, drop the Louis in my lap. All my ladies say, my go girl say, hey, I got myself a say, to fill up a drink for me, to fill up a tank for me. To put something in the bank for me, myself a sponsor.
And now we have a very special guest, Professor Treva Lindsey, Assistant Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Missouri at Columbia, and of course a 2010 graduate PhD of Duke University in the Department of History. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you
Treva.
for having me.
We're talking this afternoon about sexuality, and particularly Black women's sexuality.
Yes.
A lot of your work focuses on this, and you're this next generation.
Right.
You know, when Shayne Lee talks about Black intellectuals, particularly Black feminist scholars,
Right.
still being beholden to this notion of Black respectability,
Right.
you're this next generation, right? This
Yes.
whole notion of sex positive,
Right.
you know, Black sexuality. Talk a little bit about this concept of sex positive sexuality.
Yes. Well, in a lot of ways, we've been thinking through this idea. I heard earlier when Shayne was talking about these kind of politics of respectability, right? That seems to focus so much on in the work that we see around Black feminist scholarship, around Black female sexual production and Black female cultural production in particular, and this real unwillingness or resistance to dealing with this notion of this Black female sexual and authorial body, right? To think about this pro-sex position as somewhere where we can begin thinking about what does it mean? What does it look like for a Black woman to healthily express sexuality within the context of popular culture, right? And popular culture becomes this particularly interesting space to think about it because there's so many ways in which the history of images of Black women, the history of the gays, and all of this that we're thinking about comes through in popular culture. But at the same time, as we were saying, it's also this subversive space where you have the creativity and the possibility to think beyond these myths and this history. And so for those of us coming up thinking about this notion of a pro-sex position or a sex-positive position is to say there are these women trying to make these interventions, but we don't yet have this language or these tools to recognize it beyond saying, okay, is this a recreation? Is this a reproduction of this? Is it a way in which we're responding to heterosexual male desire, right? That's the only gaze, and not thinking about the way in which Black women pleasurably invest in certain kinds of narratives and certain kinds of productions that are about their own sexual agency and desire. I mean, I think about in particular the response to Sierra's video that was banned on BET. Two of the videos that were banned this year were Tierra Marie's Sponsor and Sierra's Ride, and both around this context of like, this is too sexually explicit.
Right.
And this is in conjunction with so many of the other videos that I thought about on like entertainment television at the time, and it seemed very odd. And then I began to think, wait a minute, these are two women talking about, in particular Sierra, and a black female sexual agency.
Right.
And what language we yet to have around this authorial body, right? What to think about it as a subject and not an object. I think we all agree, even among those of us taking this pro-sex position, that there is this oversaturation of the black female sexual object. But then it just becomes the blanket way in which we read all productions of black female sex and black female sexual desire within the context of popular culture.
The last decade or so, the conversations have changed around black female sexuality.
Yes.
There have been a significant amount of events that have become kind of fault lines.
Yes.
We go down to Spelman and Nelly's Tip Drill video
Right.
being one. Janet Jackson in the Super Bowl.
Yes.
And Justin Timberlake. But perhaps none has been more powerful than the publication of Karine Steffans.
Yes. Confessions of a Video
Confessions
Vixen.
of a Video Vixen. Talk a little bit about how you process that particular book and that work
Right.
around these discussions of black female sexuality.
Right. Oh, wow. There's so many layers to it and ways you can think about talking about this book. But in particular, which starts almost this kind of genre of literature, right? This further kind of tell-all, and we think about
Confessional,
right?
Nas and Jay-Z.
Right, Carmen, right. And even before that, and we've had, a couple of books that have done with kind of the groupie, right? But going beyond that and starting with this story with her own experiences. And I think this is what actually made it less interesting for me, I must say, about this, is that it begins with kind of the story of her own experiences with sexual abuse as this, and that has been used as a way, even by feminists, particularly black feminists, to think about, well, it's because this happened to her that she chose to have sex, right, with all these men, and use sex as this power. But in a lot of ways, her novel, the book, read like so many songs you hear about black male conquest and interactions with women and in this space, right?
That's part of what Shayne says, right? We don't think twice about men as hoes.
Right,
That's
hoes is already gendered in a certain way,
right?
And that's a particular space. So when she begins to snitch, as it's been framed within hip hop culture, about her interactions with these men, what in fact she gained from that, and the fact that she took pleasure in various ways in being superhead and being someone that was seen in a particular way around this, we don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
We know that we're like, okay, feeling that a groupie is the way to be, or to get money from men doesn't really give you agency, or there are all of those things, but there's nothing around, what if she just liked interacting with certain kinds of people? Men, women, various
wanted to have very different kinds of sexual experiences with
right? And we only know that, and then it's not flipped back onto the people she's interacting with to think about what may in fact be dangerous or problematic even about that culture, right? It's not a critique of a culture in which this exists and that there seems to be an unfettered access to female bodies for sexual pleasure, but instead it becomes this kind of close your legs and everything improves mentality that begins to circulate.
I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here on Left of Black and joined this afternoon by Professor Treva Lindsey, the University of Missouri at Columbia in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. There's been a lot of talk recently about filling the gap, right? We have this whole now almost 40-year history of hip-hop culture and rap music.
Yes.
And it seems as though folks just figured out 5 minutes ago
right.
that the history has not done enough work in terms of placing black women within this context.
Yes.
So we've seen a rash of documentaries, one that was just recently done, by Black Entertainment Television.
Yes.
Around this kind of history of black women in rap music. And I think one of the things that we see in looking at this longer history is that very often the women who we most remember, right, we remember not so much because of their skill set, but really because of their sexuality. What kind of challenges do you think that black women continue to have?
Right.
Not just in terms of hip hop, but even more broadly in terms of black popular music, in terms of being able to be who they are and be fully honest about their sexuality, but at the same time not get trapped, into this really cartoonish version of what sexuality is. And again, this is largely an industry that's about providing for male desire.
Right.
You know, are women going to be, you know, historically trapped into this narrative, right? Because this really is all about, you know, male desire.
Right. I mean, I think I was encouraged, and particularly when you mentioned that documentary of the last few minutes of it, when they're showing this whole bevy of MCs, femcs that are around the country, right? That you see these women who are using all kinds of imagery and narratives to think about women's experiences within hip hop, actually, and women's experiences broadly within the space of popular culture that you begin to see. I think also interesting enough, in the documentary you saw this notion where there was an explanation given for why there weren't as many women is because we're too high maintenance in certain ways, that was a framing around that it costs something to maintain this, you know, this kind of provocateur that the female MC is supposed to be, whether it's provoking a certain kind of narrative about what Black female sexual agency is, brown female sexual agency is, but it is somewhat of a trap within hip hop in general, and this is not just specific to women, to reproduce a kind of heteronormative sexual desire narrative. Even with someone more recently like a Nicki Minaj, what was so unexciting for me regarding her was simply that I could have been listening to any male rapper regarding her in terms of forwarding what it means to have a sex positive agenda within hip hop, right? It still reproduced something very familiar. There wasn't this kind of pushing of those boundaries, and not that she is solely responsible for doing that, but to think that I'd still rather hear, you know, a 1996 Lil' Kim track in terms of pushing that forward if we're going to go in that route, or have something that speaks to what it means to construct yourself as an artist, right? That there's this moment of constructing that Black female artists often aren't allowed to do, that it is very boxed in, that we like to categorize and have it here. But then you have artists who are trying to go beyond that. And I'm actually optimistic about the possibilities of that when I see the success of someone like a Janelle Monáe, or I see even in Nicki's, where her own consciousness about maybe thinking about going in a different direction in terms of her own career and where she wants to go in terms of her image, because there is a lot of possibility there, right? Because she's taking signals from other tropes that have existed within this kind of 40-year span of history. She's taken some from the Lil' Kim playbook, taken some from the Missy playbook, taken a little bit from the Lauren playbook to try and create this.
Something, to cobble together
to cobble together some notion of this. But I think what we're looking for now within hip hop in general and popular culture in general is for people to push existing boundaries and to use these histories as a platform to think about new ideas and new cultural productions of self.
We talk in terms of looking at a historical lineage of feminism in this country, you know, in terms of first and second and third waves.
Right.
Around the mid-1990s, we see a bit of a swerve.
Yes.
You know, at least in Black intellectual production around feminism. You know, part of that swerve is the work of Rebecca Walker.
Right.
But of course, for our conversation, we think about Joan Morgan.
Right.
And when chicken heads come home to roost, you know, my life as a hip hop feminist.
Right.
And in some ways, you are part of the children.
Yes.
You know, of Joan Morgan's work. What has the difficulty been being able to claim your intellectual voice in this conversation? Right. You know, whereas we go back to Shayne Lee's comments that there is still an old guard in Black feminist thought that still does not want to give in to sexual. I mean, it literally does not want to give in to sexual desire. That there's this fear that something gets lost.
Right.
You know, when that occurs.
Right. I mean, I think part of that work is just continuing to push, right? To find a voice to articulate that, to acknowledge that history. I completely believe in thinking about this history and where that does play in when we do think about hypersexual images, whatever that is, but not to presume that hypersexual has already been defined, right? That we need to break down these terms that have been so ingrained now that we just, you know, kind of spout them off when we're thinking about images of Black female bodies in popular culture. Oh, this is reproducing the hypersexual narrative. Well, what does hypersexual mean? Right? What does hypervisible mean? Are we talking about an inglorious history of sexual exploitation of Black women, which is very different from categorizing something as hypersexual? Right? And to what extent are we going to allow others to dictate what it is we define as our sexual possibilities, right? And sexual mores or whatever that may be, and get to real discussions about, okay, if we're not talking about this, what are the consequences, right? And I think we can really point to those kinds of consequences around Black female sexual health, Black female conversations that still tend not to happen, but if they're happening, are still even guarded in certain kinds of ways and entrenched in these other narratives about what we should be talking to, what we ought to do, right? As opposed to what is happening and what can we do to think about how we create a space among ourselves, within popular culture, to move forward with that, right?
You have claimed a little space for yourself.
Yes.
in the world of social media.
Yes.
The diva feminist.
Yes.
Who is the diva feminist?
Well, there was this position where we're trying to figure out, a few friends of mine, we were trying to figure out, we had Crunk Feminists, there are all these kind of tropes.
Crunk Feminist Collective. You
Yes,
need to check out the
Collective.
site.
Awesome site.
What's up to Moya Bailey?
Yes. This was down in Spelman. Yes. So there was this notion of, how do I identify myself within feminism, right? How do I look at some of the things I love? I love writing about fashion and popular culture and the ways in which I see so many of the things I teach about in the classroom, whether it's the construction of gender, sexual identities, racial, ethnic identities, and what are the ways in which I've come to understand them, right? And a lot of that had to come through this notion of popular culture, but particularly these kind of iconic female bodies, right? To think about in our own generation, someone like a Beyonce, but in earlier generation when I was doing work around Josephine Baker, right? To think about this
Pam Grier in
the 70s, right? You just move through this. And so to look at these women and be able to talk about so many of the histories, tropes, and ideas about Black womanhood, right? And about womanhood more broadly, and then even further about certain kinds of identities within hip hop, right? And more broadly. So it gave me a lens and it gave me a way to identify myself within hip hop as someone who loved these things, but also saw them as the way to interrogate and really inquire about these categories that we have, and to not make them static for myself, right? That they move. And you know, thinking about someone even like Janet was probably one of the most interesting for me to think about in the context of this, because of her own investment, particularly around gender, pushing kind of gender and sexual boundaries in her performance, right? I think when you guys were talking earlier about Jill Scott, Janet, and Beyonce, the chapter in his book, and Janet's performances always kind of push these boundaries of what we feel is appropriate, even within the context of a major concert space, a live concert space. And she is this voice of this kind of community of what's really happening in these spaces in which people are exploring the boundaries of their own identities, and that she lives, and that it's a Black body that's already queered in certain ways because of that, to have that space to do that.
We're talking here with Professor Treva Lindsey at the University of Missouri at Columbia. What are you working on these days?
Wow, well, working on these
What are you working on?
Well, I'm working on the manuscript now, they're revising the dissertation, and which looks at New Negro womanhood and in the urban Upper South, and specifically Washington, D.C., to really think about the ways in which Black women use popular culture, aesthetics, beauty
and
culture,
historically used
historically used popular culture, and to make these interventions into these presumed masculinist spaces, and to think about their own notions of agency and modern identity. So it really connects in terms of my work in popular culture, even now looking at work that I'm doing around hip hop soul, right? And thinking about Black female agency for love, and that's a kind of working project about how we think about how Black women in kind of this post-industrial 1980s, 1990s moment are thinking about their own identities and beginning to think about the possibilities of pushing respectability, not just around sexuality, but around race and gender as well, to think through their own struggles and triumphs as women.
We've been joined by Dr. Treva Lindsey, the diva feminist, Assistant Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Missouri at Columbia. We'd like to thank Treva for joining us today, Dr. Treva. We'd also like to thank Dr. Shayne Lee for joining us earlier from Tulane University. You've been watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We'll see you next week.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.